It's my pleasure to introduce and I get to moderate tonight's panel featuring Rex Pickett, Caryn Radick, and Brian Schottlaender. And so I'm very much honored to share the stage with them tonight. As you know, Rex is a UC San Diego alumnus and Academy Award-winning author. He's most notably known for the critically acclaimed, as the critically acclaimed author of the novel Sideways, which was adapted into an award-winning feature film directed by Alexander Payne. Sideways received multiple Academy Award and Golden Globe nominations, and of course won both of those awards. Rex is also the author of 2 Sideways sequels and the screenwriter of My Mother Dreams the Satan's Disciples in New York, which captured the 2000 Academy Award Best Live Action Short. And Rex, I actually watched that yesterday on YouTube. It was amazing.
Yeah, it was directed by my ex-wife, who I met here at a Manny Farber film class, and we were watching Robert Aldridge's Kiss Me Deadly. And honestly, and then we went off to make 2 feature films together, and she produced them, but unfortunately acted in them. So that ended that part of my career. But then she went off to the AFI to reinvent herself as a director, and that was her thesis film. It was an original script I wrote in 3 days as an exercise, and it won the 2000 Academy Award. She invited her new husband there, not me. And then she said, I can't get any more tickets. And then she thanked her mother, and she stood up. So she lied to me. That's what everyone does in Hollywood. And I was at a party, and tears are coming out of my eyes, whatever. But she did give me the Oscar for 2 weeks. It's amazing how much free wine you can get at wine bars when you're holding one of those. It's incredible. But yeah, but when she read Sideways, she told me to burn it. And I'm not, she said, it'll ruin your career, Rex. I said, Barbara, I don't have a career. So anyway, but yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I'm glad.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Honestly, I had to get divorced. I would never have written Sideways. She was starting to colonize my unconscious. And artists can't have that, you know. That's grounds for divorce, ladies and gentlemen.
They will come back to that.
Okay. All right. I know we're supposed to keep this PG-13.
So as you all know, Rex is the author of The Archivist. And one reason we're so closely connected with Rex is he has deposited his archives in our Mandeville Special Collections. All right, so let me move on to Caryn. Caryn Radick has a master's in library and information science from Rutgers University, a master's in Victorian literature from the University of Nottingham, which I find fascinating, and a bachelor's in English from Dickinson College. She's worked in special collections and archives at Rutgers since 2004, first as a processing archivist and now as a digital archivist. Her scholarship explores the use of an archival lens in fiction, which is exactly what we're talking about tonight, and includes an article that I actually want to go read now. That it takes an archival view of Bram Stoker's Dracula, so fascinating. And then rounding out our panel is a dear friend to the library, UC San Diego University Librarian Emeritus, Brian Schottlaender. So Brian served as our university librarian from 1999 until his retirement in 2017. So Brian and I aspire to such an amazing and long tenure. And he is currently one of the principals of Rework Library Consulting. Brian came to San Diego from UCLA, where he was an associate university librarian for collection services. And towards the end of his tenure there, he served as the senior associate to the executive director of the California Digital Library, where he launched the Online Archive of California, which is one of the signature, nationally known online archival platforms. So it's just amazing work. Brian is active in the American Library Association, of course, across all our profession, and is one of our profession's most respected consultants with expertise in collections management, workflow optimization, and the application of technology in libraries. He's received numerous awards, and I'll just call out 2 very notable ones. First, the Margaret Mann Citation, and second, the Melville Dewey Award. So really a notable person in our field. So let me pause and let's welcome all of our speakers. I thought, Rex, maybe I could open by throwing the first question to you. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about what inspired you to write The Archivist.
I got an offer to go to the country of Chile to write Sideways Chile. And I was in LA, and I'd been in LA for 3 decades, and I truly loathed that city. It had gotten to the point where you thought long and hard whether you were going to go to Whole Foods and shop. And And so I gave up my apartment, and Linda Clausen, the wonderful director here, actually said to me I did a faculty club event in 2005, we'd love to take your collection, Then after that faculty club thing where I was fairly irreverent, and I think the tape has been erased, I think she withdrew the offer. No, I'm kidding. She wanted to, but so when I left, to go to Chile, I was literally just going to give up my apartment and everything. And I had boxes and boxes of writings. And so I called Linda or emailed her, and because you can't get her on the phone. And she said, no, we'd love them. And so with an intern, I dropped off. I literally left University of California, San Diego to go to USC Film School in '80, whatever, with 5 boxes of writings. That's all I had, and some books. And I came back I had to give all my book collection. I came back with 50 boxes and no children. That was it. That's my life. And I dropped them off down in, I don't know, wherever, a loading dock, facility guys down there. And I honestly, I thought they were just going to write Pickett on the boxes and put them, somewhere. But as I said, I thought, well, okay, that's cheaper than public storage. Seriously, that's what I thought. And I went off to Chile and I wrote that novel. I came back and we did Sideways, the play here at La Jolla Playhouse with Des McAnuff, and and that was, it broke all records, and that was wonderful, and everything else. And they had another faculty club dinner, and I went down and saw my collection, and it was, it's my whole life there, and in these gray document boxes, and and there it was, and so lovingly and wonderfully, I guess you use the words processed and organized. I said archive, but I can't use that as a verb. I've since found out. And and I just, and I met the woman who processed my papers, and I started, wow, this is an interesting world. I didn't know what this world was. And but to see your work there, your life's work, it's just such an incredible honor. And then that there were these people working in ostensible anonymity, which they are, and then of course there's also the writer in me too. Start saying, okay, and I started thinking, no one's really written about, Archivist, and then you have to find the story in a way, and but it was I think was meeting the person who processed my papers, and just seeing, sorry. And that really, started an ideation process, because that's what I do. That's my life. And I thought, in a way, well, there was a funny story. She said, "Who's Irv Tons?" And I said, "What?" And I blushed. And it was a pseudonym I used for a porno novel I'd written when I was 20. And say, you're supposed to curate your archive, whatever. But assiduous archivist that she is, I think she read it from cover to cover. Well, it gets lonely down in the stacks. 50 Shades of Poverty. But it was just. I mean, you can tell. I mean, I did not tear up. I'm not like that. It was just such a moving experience. And then you take that leap, for the few of you who've probably read the book, but you take that narrative leap from that, if I can find that emotional experience. And then I started to think of a young archivist who comes in as a project archivist to take over the processing of the papers of a famous author. So now you start to fictionalize in a way. But it's really, it was really seeing my archive and talking to, and she's here tonight, Kate Said. She's my archivist. Well, she does. She's an archivist. Not mine. And she really introduced me to a world. I mean, I'm tired of cop shows and ER doctors and lawyers and whatever. Why not an archivist? You're giving over those boxes, have especially me, it's personal for me, all my diaries. In fact, I said to her at one point, I said, you know me better than I do, seriously, because she'd read everything. And And it really was that was really the inspiration for it, was giving my papers over, not knowing what was going to happen, then finding out, and then seeing that there is a whole world here. And then I made a leap that archivists are like detectives in a way. And then I think Kate at one point said something about dark archives, which is dark storage. And when she said dark archives, that, I don't know, because I'm a big fan of Raymond Chandler and mysteries. So that combination of things. So I think between Long Goodbye and maybe there's a tragic love story in there too. And that's kind of my, I love tragic love stories, like The English Patient or something like that. And so it started to kind of grow and build and ideate. And then I did some other things, and I wrote it as an 8-episode limited series. And I was so swept up in it, I wrote the whole thing out. 500, you just don't do that. You write the first episode and your agent hopefully sells it, you write the pilot. And I wrote it all out. And then I got a call from Blackstone Publishing. They did all the Sideways audiobooks. And I said, we're now a publisher now, and we love your work or whatever. And do you have anything? I said, yeah, I just wrote an 8-episode limited series adapted from a novel I didn't write. And now I want to write it. And I sat down and I wrote, and so, it's long. I wrote the first draft in 90 days. Just poured out of me. I mean, literally in a total cataract creativity. And
wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, no, it was just a really moving experience for me, because this university meant everything to me. I grew up in Claremont, which is just, I was just headed down a stoner surfer motorcycle, early death of Seconal. And I came here. I luckily got in. I don't know how I got in, actually. Someone must have passed the white envelope. But, and it changed my life. I came here 10 miles away from Claremont, and this was just a citadel of learning, and I was just exposed to these great minds. And that library, I used to walk from Muir over there through the eucalypti and whatever, and be Brian and Michael Davidson and Linda were probably the only ones in there. I'd sit on the 7th floor all by myself reading. And this university means so much to me. And, the book to me is like a love letter to this university. It's a story, and there's a murder mystery and everything else going on, but it's really a love letter to this university and what it means to me. My high school I could care less about. And,
Rex.
Anyway, I'm sorry.
There's something that stood out to me as well as you talked about this book as a love letter to the university and a love letter to archives. Caryn and Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like, what is working in an archive like? And what is working in an archive like? So or a library like? So Caryn, tell us.
One of the things that archivists will tell you, a lot of the things that we love about it is that you kind of get to snoop around in other people's lives, and you get to read other people's mail, and if, a certain type of personality that's very attractive. I will say there might be a little more tedium than Rex describes in his book, although there were times when I was reading it when I kind of felt like, okay, this is a little too much like my day job. So this is not necessarily giving me the escape that I yearn for in fiction, but really interesting. Definitely there are sort of the flip side of what Rex is saying, these sort of very rewarding experiences where you get to see that the work that you've done matters in some way, that you make a connection for somebody. And I used to really enjoy doing reference, because that is where you get those sort of detective stories. Somebody has a question, and you need to kind of hunt through the clues that other people have left you to try to get them the answer. So I always like to think of what I call my favorite reference question was somebody who got in touch with me and said, I didn't go to Rutgers, I went to Princeton, I hope that's okay. And I said, yeah, it's fine, you're down the road from us, whatever. And he said, I just found out that my uncle who died in World War I found something online. Apparently he went to Rutgers for 1 year. Do you happen to have anything about him? And I said, okay, what's your uncle's name? And we have biographical files in the archives. So I was able to find his uncle's name. And as I was going through his biographical file, I found a reference to something that I wasn't aware of called the War Service Bureau records, which during World War I at Rutgers, somebody set up a clearinghouse where they had all the Rutgers men send letters into Rutgers about what they were doing during World War I. And they would send these letters about what was happening at Rutgers. So it was like, Paul Robeson's playing football, and then Paul Robeson's playing this other sport, because he was playing all these sports at that time. So I went and I found that folder as well. just made some photocopies, mailed it off to the guy, who's sort of a regular. Interesting to me to know about these things. And when he got it, he wrote to me and he said, there was a photograph from the alumni bulletin. I sent that as well. And he said, I never saw a picture of my uncle before. He was dead before I was born. My family wouldn't talk about him. But they had this very strong streak of pacifism. I never quite understood. So I had this moment where I had this email, and I forwarded it to my mentor, who I was lucky enough to work with. And I said, this is why I'm an archivist. I've given this man part of his family history back because we kept it. And I was able to find it. So those moments are probably very rewarding. And they kind of balance off the tedium.
Wow, that is amazing. I think like in the library world, we talk about serendipity, Brian, and that unexpected finding of something. Now, our audience may not appreciate this, but we think about librarians and archivists as different sorts of professions. So, Brian, I think you were a librarian, right? Not an archivist. Is that a fair statement? So, what's the difference?
Well, that's a really good question. In fact, I was saying to Caryn earlier that it's interesting to be on this panel as a librarian because I'm not an archivist. And my archivist colleagues in the room, like Laurel McPhee and others who work in archives, would be the first to point that out, in a loving way, of course. But the difference really has to do with the depth to which archivists interact with the material they are charged with stewarding. And so the kind of research that Caryn describes and Rex describes, albeit in a fictional way, this sort of in-depth getting to know the subject is quite unusual in the profession. It's a very different way of approaching content. And to be honest with you, my interaction with archives, which has been substantial over the last 25 plus years, has not been as an archivist, but as somebody who has promoted their use or has used them himself in research. Thank you for mentioning the Online Archive of California, because when I was seconded to the California Digital Library in 1997, it was in the name of promoting the use of archival resources, and that had begun with approaching them from the vantage point of creating access mechanisms of various sorts. And then it was a logical step to say, well, why can't we actually have the material itself? I mean, it's nice to guide us to it, but we'd actually like the material itself. Can you help us with that? And so we began a fairly massive scanning undertaking, and that's described in Rex's book for your particular archive as well. And Caryn, of course, is a digital archivist, so she now lives and breathes this. But in those days, this being 1997, it was pretty unusual. And so the first object of our attention was the Japanese-American relocation archive at UCLA, which is a meta-archive of many archives. We worked very closely with the Japanese-American National Museum in LA, and selected an archive that we thought had an important story to tell, and that would be visually compelling in and of itself. And that was the Estelle Ishigo archive. Now, Estelle Ishigo, I learned in the process of working on this project, was a white woman who was interned in Manzanar with her Japanese husband, and was told during the relocation she didn't have to go, and she said, no, I'm going. And when she got there, ironically, enjoyed a number of privileges that Japanese Americans did not, because she was white. And one of them was she was allowed to document life in the camps. She was an artist and a photographer, and she photographed Manzanar voluminously and painted Manzanar voluminously, and she wouldn't have been able to do either. And so she was able to tell the story of the relocation to that particular camp in a way that wouldn't have otherwise been the case, which we thought was a very good thing, until it was pointed out to us by one group of users of this content, well, that's all well and good, but she wasn't actually Japanese. And that's kind of a problem. And that left us with an interesting conundrum because we felt it was important content, that the story it had to tell was important, but we wanted to honor the fact that while it was her story, it wasn't their story. And it allowed us to reach out to our colleagues at the Japanese American National Museum, who were much more adept at telling that story than we were, to begin to build a narrative that was properly respectful of the circumstances that led to that particular archive. I could go on, one can about archives, right? But I won't, but that's one little taste of my interacting with them.
It's an amazing story, and you're right. Archives are, by design, uneven, right? That they dive so deeply on a topic by virtue of the collections we hold, right? You get to see deeply into an author's life and their experience, but you don't necessarily get that broad. You're not going to have the parallel collection that goes with it. Rex, in the book, you talked a lot about the digital archive. It was such a big piece of kind of how the novel played out. Maybe this is a question to Caryn as much as it's you, but I'm curious why the notion of a digital archive stood out to you, and maybe talk a little bit about that.
For the few who read the book, what I needed was a place where the archivists who supposedly drowned accidentally had hid things. And so and I'm thinking as a fiction writer, so I'm thinking of these dark archives or dark storage or whatever. And I talked to a guy at BYU he was a digital archivist, and he was going to retire in a year, and he was just like putting up tons of stuff, digitizing it. And I said, how would we know where to find it? And he goes, well, I have a notebook. I mean, are you kidding me? Digitizing tons of, we lose the notebook. So to me, it's almost like a cosmology of stuff. Who knows what's out there? And I think, Kate said to me at one point, she said, Smithsonian only has 2% available to the public, 98% isn't. Now, I'm not saying it's all digitized. It could also have stuff, has restriction. So as a novelist, I'm looking for conflict. It's interesting. I'm looking for things that are like, if we take James Baldwin's archive, it has tons of restrictions because there's probably some pretty sensitive letters and things in there that can only be whatever. So all those things, are, that they're still there. So we're talking, I love some of the deeper themes, preserving the historical record, which is exactly what you were going to, Brian, and also what you were saying too. And I'm interested in that theme as well, but that you can have things out there on dark storage, but only certain people, my heroine, Emily Snow, this young project archivist who's sort of like comes in for one project and she goes out, and hopefully maybe she'll go on to sleuth another day in a way, to discover something out there. And then, oh my God, it's like a Pandora's box. It just opens up, So that's, from a fictional side, yes, there's no question I romanticize the profession.
Sure.
I also romanticize.
You're a novelist, yeah.
Yeah, but I romanticize the profession, I also romanticize hitching posts and his wine suck, so I didn't know he was gonna, it was gonna be a movie. But in this case, I needed to do that. And so the dark archives spoke to me, again, from a fiction level. And then it was just a matter of continuing to research and get it right. How do we get to, this directory of stuff and other things? And then we get into ethics, crossing ethical lines too. We've talked about this when the main character confronts the professor whose stuff is hidden out there. That's crossing ethical lines. And again, conflict, and it's a Bildungsroman at that point, if you think of it, because is she going to grow up and is she going to take these risks? And okay, most archivists probably won't because they're concerned about their health insurance, but which is fine. I don't.
They have ethics.
Yeah, I don't, but that's fine. But no, seriously, what chance? Because you're talking about getting into people's personal lives, and I think that's what got to me. I thought it was just like myself. I was just going to be, no, somebody really went through that collection and, on a, folder by folder, document by document basis. And this is personal stuff I write, journals and everything else. So what if some of it is hidden? What if some of it, and we could get into another subject here too, because in this climate we're in, how much is a collection, for example, curated and scrubbed today? Because you wouldn't want certain things in there because you have the legacy of, we don't need to get on to, but in my case, like I said, here's my boxes, it's porno novels, everything, whatever, I don't care. But maybe I would have gone through it a little more carefully
had you but known.
Known what I know now, yeah. But I'm an open book, as you can tell. I have nothing to hide, whatever. But fortunately, I have fewer sands, left in the top than I do in the bottom. So, I don't really care. But honestly, that's it. I love the personal side, what Caryn brings up and what Brian brought up in a way that, and preserving the historical record. And again, something we always had way back then, with art, what is truth? And to me, archivists are at that threshold, to me, standing there. What is the truth of this person's life? What is the truth of this, the thing that, that you mentioned? And I always thought, what is in art, what is truth? And so, and again, the big line in the novel when she approaches the professor is, dumps all this stuff on him that she's found, that he's buried. Well, the woman who was his lover buried, whatever. How do you want to be remembered? That line really grabs me in a way. How do you want to be remembered? And I don't know. That's about truth, and it's warts and all and everything else.
Wow. Caryn, so you work in digital archives, so you work on EADs probably and building encoded archival descriptions. I think my question is, what are the mechanics? What do you do, when you're surfacing this collection, you're actually writing that biographical note about something. So what is that like?
Right, right. So when you're processing a collection, you want to write what we call, the finding aid, so that people can navigate the collection and get to the thing that they're trying to get to. And it's a balancing act in some ways, because you can't, thinking in terms of paper, though we were talking about digital also, you just can't get at everything. If you think of the sheer volume of what you create on a daily basis between your emails, your social media, forget about paper, so going back to digital, what you're doing on your iPhone, you're generating these records. So the idea is to somehow provide a guide to what the records are. So if you're lucky, you have information about your subject. So presumably, Kate, who was working on Rex's papers, was able to construct a biography, but sometimes you're not that fortunate. So you have to do the kind of research. And I always felt when I was doing processing that anything I dug up was important to put in the finding aid, because some of this can be very hard to find. And as you know, at a university, things change all the time. You're this position and then you're that position, and trying to find out when things changed and how they changed can take much more effort than you would expect. So it's this balancing act of, what are people going to think is important? What things are in there that people wouldn't expect that they might be interested in? Maybe somebody was a science professor, but they had some sort of hobby that was very important to them, that somebody who was interested in that hobby would want to know about. And then there's just literally going through the boxes and folders, as opposed to the files, and saying, box 1, file 1 is letters from so-and-so, and box 1, file 2 is letters back to so-and-so. And again, the idea is just to allow somebody to navigate. And there are discussions about, you need to actually write it down letter by letter by letter by letter, but that gets too long. That takes way too much time. Or you can just say box 1 is letters, but that's not enough information. Somebody's gonna have to crawl through all those boxes. So just trying to kind of strike that balance where you make it navigable. And then with a lot of collections, if they're longer, you break them down into series according to themes. You want to generally go by what the creator has given you. We call it the original order. But sometimes you need to be a little sneaky about it, because sometimes the original order makes no sense, and you kind of move some things around a little bit. And then what you were saying about EAD, the encoded archival description, that's just a way to, if you produce a finding it in a Word document, it's a method of coding that we use that kind of meets archival standards so that these descriptions are kind of encoded in a certain way. Now it's much more automated. I used to do the EAD by hand, so I kind of miss those days. It's just really about thinking about how somebody might go about seeking this information and trying to provide those entry points. And I'll just say also, it's the same with digitized objects where you have the metadata. And the idea that you hope is that somebody types something into Google and they're going to find this object that you're describing, and then hopefully they can find something and then find the other links to know this is part of a collection. And this collection is held at this library. What you don't want is this thing just free floating in space so that nobody can connect it to where it comes from. So it's all these webs and interlacings.
That's a really great point. And so it's like the context that the object lives in kind of puts a little bit of truth around it, or it helps you interpret that. And so maybe, Brian, this is a question to you. When you think about how somebody identifies truth in an archive, when Rex created all of this stuff, he wasn't thinking about what the truth was, right? You were just compiling your collection. So, Brian, how do you think about that? Like, how does a library and archive represent a collection once it's been passed on?
That's a really good question, and I want to marry that to a point that Rex made. He used the word curate. Which is the first time that word's been used in this conversation yet. So the library can curate, the archivist can curate, but so can the person creating the archive. And in fact, there are famous examples. The Germaine Greer archive, for instance, is a very famous example of the creation of an archive as a performative exercise, right? Germaine Greer's archive was created by her specifically to present her the way she wished to be remembered.
And this is an interesting
And
point.
she had many interns helping her do that.
Wow.
So you come to it as a researcher thinking, ooh, I'm going to learn all this really cool stuff about Germaine Greer that she wants you to learn, the way she wants you to learn it, right? Now that's kind of an extreme example, but that's sort of on one end. The person who just, accumulates stuff and hands it to a library is kind of on the other end. And then most of us are sort of in the middle. We do a certain amount of organizing. Your boxes were probably sort of organized. And that's where people like Caryn and Laurel and others, Kate, where their expertise comes to bear. And I'm not sure that it has as much to do with, is this a Colbertism, truthiness, as it does with fairness and a kind of fair representation of the individual, an organized representation of the individual, so that you can sort of see the arc of the person's work and or life. Recognizing that there are always surprises. I went to do my first research in the Berg collection at NYPL in the William S. Burroughs archives when those archives were released to the public. And as you said, there's many files in there, correspondence to so-and-so, correspondence from so-and-so. And yet, as good as the archival description is, and it's good, I have a copy of the finding aid, it's about 80 pages long. What it doesn't say, of course, is, well, what's in the correspondence, right? And so as a researcher, you're just thinking, well, interesting. Correspondence from Maurice Girodias to Barney Rossett, correspondence from Barney Rossett to Maurice Girodias, and then you get into the file and you realize those dudes hated each other. And the correspondence is pretty nasty. Now, but the archivist isn't going to tell you that, because that's not what archivists do. So, the truth that an archivist brings to the collection she's organizing will get you so far, and then somebody's going to have to dig a whole lot deeper, as they do in Rex's novel.
But what happens when you find things in there, a question to Caryn and you, Brian, actually, that are compromising, maybe they weren't aware of it, but you know if you went up higher with it that it might get 86th. But you as an archivist, you're sitting there at that moment, just you with that compromising, that might, compromise that material. What do you do? I mean, that's kind of one of the questions.
I'm going to let you address that one first.
Yeah, thankfully I'm low enough down the chain that I talk to my boss or my former mentor. I did have a collection that sounds a little bit like your experience about being asked about the name on the novel, where somebody had left floppy disks and we printed them out, and it was a very personal journal. And I was just going through it and saying, like, he doesn't know he gave us this. He doesn't know that we have this. There's no way. And thankfully, this was a professor who was still kind of engaged. So he came in one day to look at his papers, and he just said, "Oh, there's some personal things in here," and said, "Well, here's some pink strips of paper. Just put them anywhere that you want to flag, and we'll just restrict them." And there were lots of pink flags kind of hanging out, but he didn't pull it. He did kind of want this to be kept, but he just kind of recognized, there's third-party privacy issues. There were just things in there that he could have been fine about being open about, but there were other people named, and there was just no way that it was going to be put in a finding aid and just kind of left for people to find.
But do you think, Brian, there's more Germaine Greering going on today in this moment? Well, I mean, that's fascinating, because you would think, I would want to, well, not me, but represent yourself in such a way, because it's her legacy, and there's money involved in that legacy too, and there also could be a taking away of money from that estate if they find something that now would be politically incorrect or whatever.
To be perfectly honest with you, I think there is probably not more of that going on, because frankly, it's too much work. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, no, I imagine.
I mean, just think about what archival processing is like, period, much less putting how do I want to present myself to the world is a really big question, and a boatload of work associated with that. So I rather doubt it, frankly. Yeah. I mean, Germaine Greer is an unusual woman, and so for her, maybe that made sense. I do think that, I think it's fair to say, Caryn, most archivists want, right, as much to be as much accessible as possible, right?
Absolutely.
Stipulating that isn't always going to be the case. And you but even then, you at least want people to know, we have this stuff, you can't have it for the next 50 years, but we have it, it's safe. The worst thing that can happen to an archivist is for somebody to say, I want that back, or I don't want that included in the archive.
That was my next question. No, I'm kidding.
I don't mean to suggest that never happens, because of course it does, but that isn't what the archivist wants, right? Yeah.
Wow. But Rex, I'm curious, we have your papers up until 2011, I think?
Yeah, no, it needs a new accession.
A new tranche.
What?
A new tranche, thank you, yeah. I've done a lot, so I quit drinking 12 years ago, so I've been very productive, yeah, actually.
What will your archive look like when it comes to us? Will it be paper still? Will it be all of your iPhones?
Well, what I find is if I, well, that gets an interesting question about email, because, there were a lot of journals that were handwritten in my original archive, but as we kind of got around 2000, really my journal are emails, and now even text, because I write text on a computer, so if they're long, and of course most people are reading them on their phone, geez, there's Rexy, and blows out their iPhone, but I write some really long emails and texts and stuff, and I actually found it's actually in the novel, how you get to those emails or whatever. But I found print out as much as you can, because, see, here's the thing, Kate said to me, see, there you have 27 linear feet, and I thought, wow, that's impressive. And so has 54 linear feet. So now I have linear feet envy, if I printed out some of those 3.5 floppies, everything on them, not that they would always, you'd want 40 drafts of My Mother Dreams of Satan's Disciples, another reason for the divorce. Anyway, I I would come as I would try to do as much hard copy as I could, because all you're going to do is digitize it and it's going to be out there. And I'd rather have it, something physical. So I'm printing out stuff now,
That's good to know. That's good to know. All right, let's see if there's any questions. Yes.
Yeah, I had some questions about, there was a controversy recently with San Diego State. A couple had donated a collection, I believe, of jazz recordings, and San Diego State wanted money to manage that collection, and it really offended the donors. So could you talk about the economics of what's involved and what's expected when you make a donation? I'm also wondering what tool, as somebody that was formerly a computer person, is technology assisting at all in being able to deal with the costs involved in whatever work you do? Thank you.
Those are two amazing questions. Brian, I'm curious, could I turn to you for the economics of archival processing?
Yeah, well, like anything in the world and like anything in libraries, nothing is free, or generally it's not free. And so any of us who've been involved in the management of archival collections of any magnitude have long been working on documenting the costs associated with their processing. And we do that for two reasons. One, often as not, we're asking somebody for money to help us do that processing, whether it's the donor of an archive or some extramural funder. And two, because often people like Erik get asked by their administrators, so what are you spending all that money on? And it behooves us to have good answers to those questions. So 5 years ago, when I was still in Erik's seat, if you had asked me, what does it cost to process an archive, I could have told you basically down to the linear foot. Having said that, it's a kind of gradient of costs, meaning that, to your earlier point about how archives are organized, to organize an archive to this level will cost this much. To organize it to the next level will cost that much additionally, and on down. If you then subsequently get into actually digitizing the content of the archive to make it accessible on the web, there's yet another cost. And so there are all of these incremental costs, and they are not inconsequential. University libraries, at least, I can't speak for private archives, but university library archives are in no way, shape, or form adequately resourced. And I'm talking about the Yales, the Harvards, the Chicagos, the Columbias, not to mention the UCSDs of the world, to process all of the archival material they have down to the level it could be processed if money were no object. Unfortunately, money is an object. And so typically we tend to think of, folder level processing. And then if we digitize, we tend to do selective digitization as opposed to wholesale digitization in order to manage those costs.
So you're making a lot of choices, A, and then I also wonder, and I brought this up with Caryn today, in private archives, because they can probably poach archivists or whatever, are we just going to be preserving the historical record of the rich?
It's a challenging question.
It is a challenging question.
Yeah, I think it's and it does get back to how you build relationships in your archives and how you seek out collections to make sure you have the collections that are meaningful to a community. Caryn, I'm curious your thoughts on this topic, or maybe the parallel topic of how technology influences the creation and the management of archives.
Well, I have to agree with what Brian says about just the cost of it, and the cost of we get people who will say things like, oh, have you thought of digitizing such and such collection? It's like, of course we've thought of digitizing. And we have a lot of, what I like to call I'm the idea person, I'm not the implementer, which is, well, everybody thinks of these things, but it costs a lot of money, and I'm not sure UCSD seems to be better at this than Rutgers, because we do have quite a backlog because of this expense issue, because of the under-resourcing. With the technology piece, certainly things have gotten cheaper than they used to be. I work with vendors for, we do send things out to vendors for some projects because it's just easier with large-scale digitization. And everybody's gotten kind of better and smarter, and they're able to move things along. But they're also, everybody's moving slowly, I think, a little bit, post-pandemic anyway, and the timing never works out. With other types of materials, there's just that, that factor that things are always changing. So the solution that you have today is only good for today. You have to think in terms of migrating and what's going to move things along, because anything that's born digital, the way it was created is not the way it's going to be retrieved. And interestingly enough, I'm just thinking about how I work on a collection where we digitize newspapers for microfilm. And when I talk to the students and I talk about digitizing for microfilm, I say, does anybody know what microfilm actually is? And I get a lot of blank looks. But what I like to point out is that it's still a preservation standard, because with microfilm, all you need is a light source and a way of magnifying it, and you can still read it. Whereas anything that's digital and that kind of just lives somewhere online, if the power goes out, you're not getting to it. So it's kind of this interesting thing. You're investing a lot of time and energy into trying to keep these things findable and accessible. But one sort of wrong turn with it, and it can be just as easily lost. So it's definitely a tricky balance.
Well, in fact, you're right. In the preservation world, we make many copies of the digital objects, and we actually check to make sure those digital objects don't change over time. It's something called bit rot. And so it's actually a different way of approaching preservation. I think I'll stop myself. I'm getting ready to get nerdy.
Actually, can I get nerdy and come back to Rex's question about, are we only going to archive the content of the rich? So I want to make 2 points in that regard. I think the answer is no, and I think the answer is no for 2 reasons. One, I think social justice movements of various kinds over time have facilitated and in fact have forced the archiving of material from people other than the rich, right? So you can go all the way back to MLK and probably back further than that, but certainly George Floyd, BLM, Planned Parenthood, the right to vote. I mean, that just drove our archival content into the hands of any institution willing to take it. And libraries are notable for being very willing, right? We are. The second point I would make is that archives and the special collections within which they often reside serve as kind of gravitational hubs, right? So we get calls, people like Erik and I, daily saying, we understand you guys have a pretty cool archive. Don't you have the Dr. Seuss archives? There's this printer down in National City who was printing during the Cesar Chavez days. He was the printer for the movement. His print shop's going out of business. Would you like his archives? And we're like, hell yes, we'd like his archives, right? So, and that took nothing on our part, and that was the community itself reaching out to us, and that's exactly what we want. And I don't think we need to worry it's only going to be about the rich. I'm happy to say.
My question is directed to Brian. It has to do with the decreasing number of actual volumes, books in the library, due to digitization, I presume. Do you see that trend continuing, and does that have the effect in the long run to make libraries more concerned with doing archival work as opposed to the general circulation work that was done, say, 10, 20 years ago?
I appreciate your directing that question to me, and I'd be happy to answer it or give you my answer for it, but I'd like to ask Erik to answer that question, actually.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
So I think printed books are definitely used less today because there's so much information online. One of the revolutions that's occurred in libraries over the last 10 years, I'd say, is the realization of the power of digitization. So digitizing books unlocks the potential, or kind of unlocks those books for current and future generations. So something Brian spearheaded way before my time at UC, and I was very proud to continue, was our participation in the Google Books project. It's just a small example. And so that, Brian, it's 40 million volumes in HathiTrust. And so I think that while we see less physical print book use, the digital version is seeing a lot of use. And this is one of the reasons why libraries are just such amazing institutions. Because we bought all those books in the first place, means we get to say how they're used in the future. And it goes actually straight to your question of the power of building archives. Is that, Rex, you said this earlier, archives are love letters to the future. I think you said it slightly differently, but the things we're collecting today actually will form the foundation for research in the future. And so, yeah, archives are very powerful, but as is the printed word and the digitally printed word, I think. So, Brian, what's your version of that answer?
Well, all of that, plus the kind of fixed resource base that most libraries have to contend with, right? Yeah, we get small increases every year if we're lucky. Maybe those increases are sufficient to keep pace with inflation, but they're usually not. And so the fixed resource based nature of libraries is such that we're constantly figuring out how to allocate and or reallocate a fixed set of economic resources, right? So to the degree that I don't have to spend money caring for print books that no one's reading, I can spend more money freeing up archives that are not otherwise accessible, right? So it's unfortunately a fixed resource game. You're constantly having to figure out on what day can I rob Peter to pay Paul, knowing that on the next day I'm going to have to rob Paul to pay Peter, kind of thing. So
it's a great point. I'm actually, your response makes me think of all the national partnerships. And so we've been talking about libraries or archives as almost standalone institutions, right? It's a deep relationship with an archivist. But OAC, the Online Archive of California, the whole point was to start thinking about what's the national cooperative. And I think that's a future trend.
1,000 archives just in that one.
Yeah. We're going on and on. So are there other questions? Yes, sir.
Rex, you mentioned the restrictions, and I don't know much about archiving, but I don't understand why anybody would submit their stuff for archives if no one can see it. How do you make those decisions, and what's the restriction all about? Could you help me understand a little more about that?
It's not that no one can see them. There's a couple of different variations on that. Sometimes people can see them, they just have to apply to see them. It's just kind of not open. At Rutgers and probably at UCSD, people can just walk in, and they used to be able to just walk in and request materials. We had a flood last year. Most of our collections are off-site, so that doesn't happen anymore. So there are some people who just feel that, okay, I don't think that everybody should be able to have access to this, but maybe somebody who's writing a book, or they used to say like serious scholars, which I find kind of offensive as well, they can see my stuff. The other thing is often these restrictions, they're not restrictions forever. They're often restrictions for a certain amount of time. So somebody might say, I want these papers to be restricted till 50 years after I pass away, because I've said some really truly terrible things and done some terrible things in my life, and I want to make sure I'm long gone before anybody finds out about them. I think that's often the case. And what I was saying before about third-party privacy, about, okay, I'm fine with everybody knowing what I've done, but this other person's probably going to sue me if I let it get out that they did this thing. So this is just often a part of what happens. Certainly to get a collection where the entire collection is restricted, that would be pretty difficult, and it would make us unhappy. But you do get things where they're just portions that are going to be restricted. Also, if you're talking about someone famous or well-known, you're going to kind of put up with some of their demands to ultimately get their papers.
There you go. Thank you. So let's go for the last question over here.
The question I have for all the panelists here is, what about the Internet Archive, the nonprofit run out of this quirky building in San Francisco that really has reached out from audiovisual, book preservation, now has a big government document, library preservation, and access going with the Canadian libraries. And I just want to hear, I know there's a lot of issues in terms of copyright, authors, and all that, but it would be interesting to hear brief comments from each of you. Thank you very much.
You know, it's funny, we talk about kind of sending our stuff there sometimes when we kind of can't get our act together on getting certain things digitized. I think it's a really helpful resource. I think from time to time we found things that we like to think in terms of, well, this is Rutgers property, but if it's in the public domain, it's not really our property. It's just something that they're able to use. Certainly we look at some of their products for archiving websites, and it's just really super helpful that those kind of tools are out there and that people are out there who can really devote those resources to solving those types of critical issues of making sure that we capture the records.
That's a great point. Brian, concluding thoughts?
I mean, I think for all its warts, and there are plenty of them, and the outsized personality behind it, Brewster Kahle is quite an individual. There are two very different dimensions to the Internet Archive. One Caryn's described, which is we're going to archive the internet. Well, good, because somebody should be. And so that, yeah, do that. And then thereafter, it has become as much about, and then we're going to digitize a bunch of stuff and make it available on the archive. And Brewster is a copyright radical, and by his own admission. And there's a certain middle finger quality to Brewster, and I kind of admire that. But I know that he skirts close to the edge. But when he skirts close to the edge, he's pushing the envelope for all of us, right? So yeah, you go, Brewster, and we'll reap the benefit with any luck.
I mean, are archivists in a way like, the flood is coming, it's kind of like you've got your finger in the dike, but to end on a sunny note here, which isn't, my fort, you have to try. It's kind of like climate. I mean, I actually was on a plane back, I was in New Zealand for 6 months, and I came back, and the woman behind me was 78 years old, and she was on her 18th tour of duty at, I don't know, whatever station, Murdo Station down there. And I said to her, we got to talking, and she had a back injury. She said, that's it, I'm not going back. And I just said to her, is it over? And she goes, yep, it's over. It was that simple, but we have to try. And I think that's what I say, when you talk about, digital and server farms going down and everything else, but you have to try. You can't really lose hope. And I think that's, to end on a note that is unfamiliar for me.
Wow, thank you. Thank you all. So please join me in thanking our panelists.